Oh, good afternoon. I've come to my Freud altar here. Here's a picture of my May Freud Be With You icon, along with two statues propping him up. These are not anatomically correct statues, so you don't have to worry. Okay, but they're this little shrine to Freud, and it's long overdue, don't you think? So today we're going to answer a big question. Describe Freud's theory of personality. That's our big question, right? Okay, so as you know, personality is basically who we are over a lifetime. Who are you over a lifetime? Not your mood, not your day-to-day feeling. Who are you over a lifetime? So Sigmund Freud was trying to answer that. What kind of personality traits do we have? What kind of personality do we exhibit over a lifetime? Right? So he's going to attempt to answer that. Now today nobody likes him because we're in a scientific age. We're in the 21st century. He was doing a lot of his thinking in the 19th century. He wrote some of his works in the early 20th century, but we think of him as kind of a caveman. Now when you look at a caveman goes into battle with a stone and a stick, right? Okay, so you can make fun of that, but at that time, that's basically all they had. Okay, so when you look to Freud, okay, you're looking at a guy who's basically a caveman in that he has a stick and a stone, and that's pretty much it. So if we have our, missiles and aircraft carriers, we sometimes forget that people have to begin somewhere. And so naturally, if you're Sigmund Freud and you want to talk about things like infantile sexuality, governments are not going to fund that research like they would today. Right? No government in the 19th century is going to fund a study about infantile sexuality. They're just not going to do it, right? So again, oftentimes Freud gets bad marks because he's not very scientific. But insofar as the 19th century was concerned, he could claim to be a scientist, right? So the big thing is this, you're asking, gee, where did he come up with these ideas? How did he come to these conclusions that he did, right? Okay, he was basically borrowing from the spirit of the age. So if you look to the age in which he was writing and doing a lot of his thinking, Europe is either in World War I or approaching World War I. He dies as World War II is beginning. But one really good book on that is this book called The Vertical Years by Blum. It's a very, very good book talking about Europe going headlong into World War I. And the one thing that was really intriguing about Europe as it heads into World War I is that the Europeans were coming to the conclusion that their great civilization had some very seamy undersides to it, and maybe even a weakness. So Europe was the place that gave the world Christianity, they gave the world science and political systems and things like that. Okay, but now they were beginning to decline a little bit. Okay, they were beginning to fall apart, right? So for example, as you approach the 20th century, the British are in the middle of what we call the Boer War. And when they sent soldiers to fight in the Boer War against the Dutch in South Africa, they noticed that their men didn't have the stamina to stand up to battle. And they said, wow, okay, here we have these industrial workers that are paid badly, treated badly, and now we want them to fight for us, and they can't. They're weak. There was that feeling now as we approach the 20th century that maybe we're not as strong as we used to be. Maybe we're losing our edge. So for example, France noticed its decline in population. France was losing population, right? They were actually not giving birth to new children at the rate at which people were dying. They said, gee, maybe we're losing our edge here. Okay. And the same was true of the Americans. Remember Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was our president. He suffered severe asthma. Okay, and he always feared weakness in himself. And so naturally he becomes the cowboy president, right? I'm going to go out to the West and I'm going to show everybody what a man I am. There was that feeling that maybe we're losing our virility. In France, you have the Dreyfus case, where supposedly a French officer who is Jewish is selling secrets to the Germans, right? In fact, he was innocent, but just that feeling that somehow people that should be upholding our civilization and our institutions are letting us down, right? That was the feeling the Europeans had, right? Gee, if you look to our civilization, you see this strong beacon of Christianity and goodness and morality and science, but there's an ugly side. And so naturally, Sigmund Freud, a Jew, would see that before anybody else. It made sense that Sigmund Freud would look to the ugly underside and go, wow, maybe there's some pretty sinister impulses that reside within, and maybe we should look at those. So he's drinking in the spirit of the time. So that's one big influence on Freud. Hey, what's happening in Europe right now? Okay, the second big influence, right, comes from science, from Darwin. Okay, Darwin was the big scientist who in 1859 writes this book on the origin of the species, saying that you might not see this force of evolution directing behaviors, but in fact there is a force directing living beings toward adapting to their environment. Okay, so here's a scientist saying there's a force that's governing nature which you cannot see. And so if you're a 19th century scientist or thinker, you're allowed to say, I can still be a scientist and talk about things that people don't see. So naturally a scientist says, I want data, I want things that I can see. Okay, Darwin gives you permission to say, hey, there are things that you can't see, okay, but still talk about and still be a scientist. So Sigmund Freud, I think, was borrowing from that. Okay, you can't see the psyche. You can't see these forces within your head. You can't study them in a traditional scientific way, but you can still be a scientist and study them. Okay, so Freud was taking a green light from Darwin. So he's, again, looking to the spirit of his age. Gee, I'm looking at a Europe that's heading toward destruction, toward world war. Okay, what do I see? I see a civilization that looks like it's together, but in fact, there's an ugly underside to it. There's a feeling that we're losing our edge, right? There's a weakness, a giving over to impulse, maybe. Okay, he also borrows from Darwin who says, hey, you can be a scientist and still talk about the unseen. Okay, so Sigmund Freud says, I'm going to talk about things that you can't see, but I'm still going to be a scientist while I do it. Okay, and the third big trend or tradition that he borrows from, and people oftentimes don't mention this, he borrows extensively from Aristotle. You can see a lot of his Greek training and his Oedipus complex and a lot of the ideas that he comes up with there clearly from Greek thinking, right? Okay, but Aristotle was the one who gave us what we call the golden mean, and I believe that Freud was borrowing extensively from this, because what the golden mean says is that the wise man, the man who lives the best possible life, is the one who tries to act in the middle ground between two extremes, right? So for example, what is a good student? A good student is somebody who doesn't sign up for a class, hang out with his friends, and then drop the class. That's one extreme. That's not a good student. Then there's the other extreme, the student who spends all of his time in the library, never goes out to a party, never speaks to friends. Okay, that's what we call the nerd. So on the one hand, you have the nerd. On the other hand, you have the party animal. Okay, naturally, Aristotle would say, what's the good student? The good student is somebody who lives on the means between those two extremes. So you spend some time in the library, you spend some time with your friends, right? The good student is somebody who spends time with friends, because sometimes they teach you things. The good student is somebody who spends some time in the library, but not to extremes. So you have the extreme, okay, the nerd, okay, always in the library. The other extreme, the party animal, who is always out hanging with his friends. In the middle is the studious person. The example he gave is the soldier. So you have the very brave soldier, and the brave soldier is a means between two extremes. So some soldiers see combat and they run away. We call those cowards. That's one extreme. Okay? The other kind of soldier sees combat and he charges in without thinking. That's the other extreme, the very rash guy. So Aristotle says the good soldier is somebody who's the means between those two extremes. So sometimes the best part of bravery is knowing when to run away. Sometimes being brave is knowing when to say, hey, okay, I'm not going to win this one. I got to get out of here. Okay. The other, on other occasions, maybe it pays off to be rash. Sometimes by attacking your enemy when they overwhelm you and outnumber you is a good way to shock them and surprise them. Have you ever seen the movie Gettysburg? The most famous charge in the Battle of Gettysburg is when the 20th Maine runs out of ammunition, they fix bayonets, and they charge. Okay, it was such a shock that the Confederates ran away, right? So sometimes being rash pays off, right? So there are two extremes in being a soldier. The rash guy who simply charges in without thinking, the coward who always runs away. Aristotle says the good soldier is the guy who's in between those extremes. Sigmund Freud named those extremes, and he named the middle ground, right? So when Sigmund Freud looks to the human psyche, and why can he talk about a psyche? A psyche is something that you can't see. Okay, you can't see the psyche. You can't open up the brain and start to dissect the brain and see the psyche. Okay, it's something that's unseen. But Freud says, I can do that. I can talk about that because Darwin gave me permission to do that. Darwin says, hey, you can be a scientist and talk about the unseen. Well, I'm going to do that. Okay? I'm going to talk about the unseen part of the human psyche. Okay? And one unseen part of the human psyche is the id. Okay? Okay? That's one extreme of the human psyche. The id is that part of the human psyche which is governed by impulse, right? Gee, I see a candy bar and I'm going to eat it right now. If you got them, smoke them, right? Okay, it's the indulgence, sex, power, money, everything, right? Okay, and sometimes Sigmund Freud wanted to consider that the dark side of the human being. Okay, so some people say your impulses are not that evil. Well, Sigmund Freud saw that there were many evil impulses in the human because, again, as a Jew growing up at the turn of 20th century Europe in a Catholic empire, he saw the anti-Semitism. He said there's some very ugly impulses here. They must come from someplace. Where do they come from? They come from this part of your psyche called the id, where these impulses are, and they are not good. Okay, they need to be squelched, or it will literally destroy civilization. Okay, that's the id, the center of your impulse, right? So whenever you have these evil impulses, like I want somebody to die, or I want you to give me all of your money, or I want to try to cheat you, that's your id talking to you. Okay. On the other side, the other extreme, you have the superego, which is your denier, right? It says it's almost a cowardly part of your psyche. In other words, okay, I want to pull away from life. Okay, I have all these commands in my head that come from my parents, from society, from religion, and so on, which tells me not to do things, almost to be a coward toward life, right? Okay, I'm supposed to deny all of my impulses. That's your superego. Okay, that's the other extreme. Okay, so on the one extreme you have the self-denier that says you can't have anything. On the other extreme you have the id, which says I want you to give in to all of your impulses now. Okay, in the middle is the ego, which tries to moderate or mediate between these two extremes, right? So the ego looks at the id. Okay, the id says I want some water right now. Okay, that's the id talking. Right? The superego says, no, we should deny ourselves. We should, fast. Okay, this is a time of fasting. This is Lent. We should fast. We shouldn't give in to that impulse. The ego says, well, okay, I'm going to drink some water or I'm going to die. Okay, okay. So I'm going to moderate or regulate this desire for thirst that I have. Right? That's the ego. So he's basically a problem solver in a way. Many literature guys like this. Of course, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, that's basically what Lord of the Rings is, right? So you have Smeagol, who wants everything. He wants the ring, and of course he's killed to get the ring. That's why he's constantly struggling to talk. Okay, he's given into his impulses, right? He grabs the ring, he eats fish without cooking them. He just grabs them out of the water, eats them. He's an id. Okay, and then you have the superego, Sam, who's the denier. He's willing to give up everything. Right? He's willing to say, Mr. Frodo, remember the Shire. Okay, remember the Shire. Okay, because that for him is the center of all that's good. That's where his conscience comes from. Okay, okay. So in your Shire, you share, right? Okay, so naturally, Sam brings the food and he shares it with Frodo, right? Okay, Frodo is the one who has to solve the problem. Frodo has to destroy the ring. What did intrigue me was that Sigmund Freud, okay, gave his special followers rings. He gave 7 of his followers rings, right? And of course, naturally, he would have the 8th. And if you look to the number of men, right, who are involved in the Lord of the Ring, the Fellowship of the Ring, there are 8 of them. So sometimes I think Tolkien got his idea from that. Okay, as a matter of fact, if you look to Lord of the Files, by the way, oops, I meant to say Lord of the Flies. That was a Freudian slip because I have to do my taxes. So, oh, sorry, I said Lord of the Files, right? So my id is saying I don't want to pay taxes, okay? But if you read Lord of the Flies or see the movie of the same name, that's basically what the story's about. You have these Christian choir boys, right, that you think of as being the ultimate spokesman for civilization, but now you throw them onto a desert island, right, and they become these primitive beasts until they can restore order again, right? So again, many people find this idea appealing. You can even look to Star Wars if you'd like. There's a dark side to the Force, right? There's the Force, right? Okay, and then there's the dark side, and you have to reconcile somehow these forces, right, within you. So a lot of people find this idea very appealing. It is an appealing idea because the implication is that we do have the potential for some very evil impulses to come out. So when people called World War I the war to end all wars, Sigmund Freud warned them during that war, no, this is not the war to end all wars, because we have these evil impulses, okay, which eventually will erupt, okay, and they might be very destructive, and there might be a second world war, and of course there was, right? So the reason he's very valuable, in my opinion, is that he's something of a prophet. He's saying, don't look to the utopia, don't look to a day when you'll have Skittles rainbows and beauty and wonder and butterflies and puppies running everywhere, because we have very sinister impulses which are squelched by civilization. He said civilization makes you slightly crazy. So civilization will squelch many of these impulses. Every now and then they come out and you see some very ugly behavior. Freud is the one who warns us of that. And so that's why I like Sigmund Freud. So let's just sum up here. Okay, what's Sigmund Freud saying? When you describe personality according to Sigmund Freud wants to say this, right? Your personality is made up of the id. This is the part of your psyche with very sinister impulses, okay, which are potentially very destructive. Okay, you have the superego, which says, I want to deny these impulses. Okay, there you go, the voice of your parent when you were 3 who says, don't eat the cookie before dinner or you'll spoil your dinner. Okay, that voice is still in your head. That becomes a part of your psyche, right? The denier, hey, deny these evil impulses that you have within you. Okay, then there's the id that runs up the middle. There's the ego, which runs up the middle, that says you have to reconcile these two demands. Okay, that's the wise man. Just like Aristotle says the wise man acts between these two extremes, so according to Sigmund Freud, the wise man acts between these two extremes then. Okay, the ego, okay, has to squelch evil impulses from within, okay, has to squelch overly demanding restrictions on his behavior from the superego. Okay, your task as the human being is to run up the middle, just like Aristotle taught you, just like Freud taught you. And so now, okay, you've had some discussion of Freud. So you don't want to have too much, okay, and you don't want to have too little. You want to have just enough. So we're going to run up the middle right here and conclude the end.